Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a time where gold shimmered under the sun, silk rustled with every royal step, and the queens of Africa didn't just rule with words, but with presence. And trust me, if you were hoping to blend in quietly at court, yeah, you picked the wrong palace. One glance from a queen wrapped in sunlight and you'd know. Power doesn't whisper here, it glows. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment and tell me your city and what time it is while you're listening. I love knowing where in the world we're dreaming from together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the royal court of medieval Mali, and the first thing you feel is the light. Not just from the sky, though that's already harsh and golden, it's the light bouncing off gold. Necklaces, earrings, rings stacked like declarations. Embroidered gold thread twisting its way through layered robes. Even the queen's headdress glows like it's been dipped in sunrise. Welcome to the 14th century. You're in Niani, capital of the Mali Empire. The king might be famous for his gold-paved Hajj, shout out to Mansa Musa, but tonight, we're walking in the soft-footed steps of someone who ruled beside him, the queen. And she's not wearing a crown. She's wearing a statement. Imagine rich indigo robes layered with imported silk from across the Sahara. Each textile dyed so deep blue it almost looks black, with a subtle shimmer from metallic thread. Her shoulders are draped in a shawl embroidered with protective symbols, spirals, stars, maybe even secret scripts only she and her closest priestesses can read. The jewelry? Local gold, but also trans-Saharan trade coral and carved ivory pendants. Gifts from alliances, trophies from victories, symbols of wealth that didn't need explaining. But here's the real kicker, none of this is random. Everything she wears means something. That indigo, a color tied to mystery, water, and the divine. That spiral pattern might just be a family emblem passed down through generations of women who've ruled from the shade of a baobab tree. That thick necklace? Not just bling, it might have paid for an army once. And let's be clear, this wasn't fashion for the sake of fashion. This was strategy, woven in fabric. You're told she wears a specific anklet only when dealing with foreign emissaries. That her sleeves are cut longer during festival season. That she has an entire wardrobe of authority, each layer calibrated to speak across class, culture, even language. Some historians believe these queens participated directly in trade negotiations, religious rituals, and judicial proceedings. And what they wore in each moment. That was part of the message. Is she wearing the silk with the silver thread? She's not smiling. She's wearing the quiet earrings today. Whole political moods were read in wardrobe shifts. And yet, here's the wild thing. We still don't know exactly what some of these queens wore. Records were oral, passed down through stories, songs, proverbs. Some descriptions survive through the eyes of Arabic travelers, but even those are layered in metaphor. One called a queen's clothing, like thunderclouds dipped in oil. What does that mean exactly? Nobody knows. But don't tell me it doesn't feel fabulous. Today, textile historians and archaeologists are still trying to piece together what materials were used, how they were dyed, and what the specific cuts looked like. The consensus. It was regal. It was deliberate. And it probably sparkled just enough to stop a conversation. You step out of the court as the sun starts to dip. The queen walks past you, not quickly, not slowly. Her robe trails behind just slightly. The gold of her earrings glints with one last hit of daylight. And in that glow, you realize, she didn't need to shout. She just needed to arrive. The next morning, you're standing in the courtyard of a palace in Nubia. Somewhere along the Nile, where the wind is dry, the air smells faintly of incense and clay, and the sun wastes no time getting to work. And right there, walking toward you like a slow-moving sunbeam in human form, is the Candake, queen, warrior, ruler in her own right. Her walk is steady, practiced. Her eyes, focused. Her crown, heavy. Tonight, we're talking about the weight of a crown, not the metaphorical kind, though there's plenty of that, but the very literal, neck-stiffening, gold and ivory architectures that queens from medieval Africa actually wore on their heads. First off, forget the basic tiara. These crowns weren't shy. Nubian queens, especially the Kandake of the Kingdom of Kush, were known to wear tall, conical headpieces adorned with beads, feathers, leather bands, and metal inlays. Some had a vulture symbol, a nod to the goddess Nekbet. Others featured the iconic uraeus, a stylized cobra symbolizing divine protection and royal authority. Yes, it's the same one pharaohs wore. Because guess what? Nubia and Egypt were royal fashion rivals way before Milan and Paris. You watch her crown glint in the sun as she passes. There's no movement wasted. She's balanced this thing so long, it might as well be part of her skull. But here's what's fascinating. These crowns didn't just say, "I'm important." They said, what kind of important? Some were ceremonial, worn during coronations or festivals, constructed of wood and gold leaf or even woven reeds covered in linen and shell beads. Others were made for battle, smaller, reinforced with leather or bronze, easy to tie down under a head wrap. Queens didn't always stay in the palace, after all. Historical records tell us some of these crowns were family heirlooms, passed down from queen to queen, adjusted or rebuilt depending on the shape of the new ruler's head. Imagine that for a minute. Inheriting a crown and also inheriting a legacy of posture, precision, and perfectly timed nods. And no, they didn't wear them all the time. Some days, the queen might opt for a beaded net cap, easier to breathe in, with cowrie shells sewn around the edges, symbols of wealth and fertility. Some queens shaved their heads underneath. Others styled their hair in elaborate braids designed to peek out just enough beneath the frame. The combination of hair and crown was like handwriting, instantly recognizable. You ask a court servant how much the crown weighs. She answers, enough to remind her who she is. And here's where it gets even deeper. In some traditions, queens would fast before major ceremonies, not just to purify their bodies, but to physically prepare for the ritual of being crowned. The crown wasn't just an accessory. It was an activation. The moment it touched her head, the queen wasn't just herself anymore. She became something bigger, a vessel of authority, a living symbol of statehood. Even today, in parts of West and East Africa, ceremonial crowns continue to be blessed, stored in sacred spaces, and never, ever touched by anyone but the queen, or her highest-ranking priestess. And historians, still debating what some crown designs actually meant. Was the crescent shape on one Kushite queen's head a moon symbol? Was the vertical feather a sign of Mot, or just a local stylistic choice? Some say these symbols had clear meanings. Others argue the queens wanted it to be ambiguous, more power in mystery. Either way, you know one thing now. When a queen steps out wearing her crown, she isn't just showing off. She's announcing alignment with the gods, the land, the past, and whatever storm she's about to walk directly into. The crown shines, the people bow, and you? You're just trying to remember to keep breathing. Because even from a distance, that weight, you feel it. You're traveling west now, into the heart of ancient Yoruba land, where the air feels heavy with history, the trees sway like they're listening in, and the dye pits of the city of Ibadan are bubbling with color. Everywhere you turn, cloth is drying on lines, flapping like royal banners. And dominating the scene? One shade deeper than all the rest. Indigo. Tonight, you're stepping into the wardrobe of queens who didn't just wear blue, they ruled in it. Because when it comes to African royal fashion, indigo wasn't just a color. It was a signal, a textile, a status. And for some medieval queens, it was practically a crown in fabric form. So let's talk about it. In medieval West Africa, particularly among the Yoruba, Hausa, and Fulani, indigo dyeing wasn't just common, it was refined. Women were the primary dyers, keepers of secret recipes passed down mother to daughter like family treasure. The process was intense, time-consuming, and required real magic, okay, fermentation science, but still. Some dye pots were rumored to be 100 years old, constantly fed and stirred, like living cauldrons of color. Now picture this, a queen walks out wearing robes dyed in layers of indigo so rich they shimmer almost violet under the sun. It's not just a tunic, it's a proclamation. And no, this isn't plain cloth. It's a dyer, a resist-dyed textile covered in patterns that range from cosmic spirals to proverbs told through symbols. Maybe her robe shows a tortoise, for wisdom. Maybe a double spiral, for rebirth. The deeper the dye, the more times the cloth has been submerged. The more symbols, the more stories she's literally wrapped in. You look closer and realize, her cloth tells you who she is before she even speaks. This queen might pair her indigo robe with rows of coral beads, orange-red against deep blue, like fire on water. Her ankles are wrapped in brass rings, her headscarf folded into an architectural masterpiece that somehow stays perfectly still, even in the breeze. And here's where it gets fun. Indigo cloth wasn't just worn. It was spent. That's right. Some kingdoms used bolts of indigo-dyed fabric as currency, meaning the queen's wardrobe might double as her treasury. You hear a tale about a powerful house queen who gifted an entire bridal gown made of indigo a dyer to a visiting dignitary. Not because she liked him, but because she knew he couldn't wear it without everyone knowing where it came from. Flex. So why indigo? Because it didn't fade. Because it took time to make. Because it was impossible to fake. You either earned it or you didn't. And because, symbolically, it was associated with night, depth, and ancestral wisdom. In some cultures, wearing dark indigo was said to keep spirits close. In others, it was worn during ceremonies to blur the line between the seen and the unseen. Some queens were even buried in indigo, the cloth wrapped tightly around them like they were returning to the sky. Modern historians still debate what specific indigo patterns meant. Some argue they were personal symbols, like a secret monogram in dye. Others say they followed clan or lineage codes. Either way, one thing's clear. When a queen wore indigo, she wasn't hiding. She was anchoring herself, in time, in power, in a tradition so rich it literally couldn't be washed away. You walk past her now, and the fabric sways gently at her ankles. It doesn't rustle. It glides. And you realize, she's not just wrapped in cloth. She's wrapped in centuries of knowing exactly who she is. The courtyard smells like rain. Not fresh rain, that earthy storm just left scent that lingers in stone and cloth. You're in the royal compound of the Kingdom of Benin now. The sky is overcast, the tiles are still wet, and the queen is getting dressed. But she's not doing it alone. Tonight, we're stepping inside the dressing chamber, not the fantasy kind with velvet poofs and glass slippers, but the layered, whispered, ritual-rich process of how a medieval African queen got ready to be seen. Because this wasn't just about clothes. This was armor, ceremony, authority. Let's begin with the layers. First comes the base cloth, soft cotton or silk, sometimes imported from North Africa, sometimes woven locally. White or pale cream, a spiritual blank slate. It's tied with practiced hands, pleated just enough to give shape without clinging. Modesty and majesty go hand in hand here. Next comes the inner robe, dyed, decorated, heavier. Maybe a dyer, maybe finely woven strip cloth from a neighboring kingdom. It covers the body almost entirely, leaving the arms free. Comfort matters, after all. Queens didn't just sit around sipping ginger tea. They moved, spoke, judged, led. Then, the statement layer. This is where things get serious. A cloak of velvet, embroidered with gold thread. A sash woven with brass discs or cowrie shells, clinking softly with every step. Wide sleeves stiff with applique, each pattern possibly referencing lineage, local spirits, or recent victories. This is the robe she wears when making decisions people won't forget. And finally, jewelry. Necklaces first. Then waist chains, layered like punctuation. Then armlets made of coral, ivory, bronze. Then earrings, big enough to make a point. Then the head wrap, sculpted into something between a turban and a crown, often with a front crest that sits just above the eyebrows, like a third eye made of silk. You watch as her attendants adjust each piece with silent precision. No mirrors, just memory. They know every fold, every pin. They've done this before. And then, perfume. Not sprayed, anointed. Fragrant oils dabbed on the wrists, the collarbone, behind the ears. Maybe frankincense. Maybe myrrh. Maybe something local, like shea butter infused with crushed herbs only the palace healers know. Now here's the thing, most of this, the public never sees. They might catch the flash of jewelry or the sway of a robe from a distance. But the layering, the process, that's intimate power. It's not about showing off. It's about building a presence from the inside out. You ask one of the attendants, young, eyes bright, what the queen is like when fully dressed. She grins. Taller. And it makes sense. Because by the time she steps outside, she's not just a woman. She's a ritual. A walking declaration. Historians believe some queens had entire wardrobes based on context. One for legal matters, one for feasts, one for religious ceremonies, one for war councils. Each look wasn't about style. It was coded language. And some patterns. Still unsolved. A particular red sash with a zigzag motif shows up in multiple Benin brass plaques, but no one knows what it meant. A ceremonial belt that appears only in royal funerals is assumed to be symbolic, but symbolic of what, exactly, is still debated. That's part of the magic. Clothing as communication. Draping as diplomacy. You stand to the side as the queen takes her final step forward. Her robe sways, her jewelry sings, and her scent lingers in the air like punctuation after a powerful sentence. And suddenly, you understand. She wasn't dressed. She was assembled. You're standing at the edge of a royal procession. The drums are low and steady, like a heartbeat made of wood. The air smells like palm oil, dust, and something metallic. No, wait, that's gold. Real gold. And it's not just in coins or crowns. It's walking past you, clinking and gleaming on wrists, ankles, necks, ears, and even braided into hair. Tonight, we're talking about jewelry. But not the kind you pick up for fun. This is message jewelry. Armor jewelry. Don't you dare question my power, jewelry. Because in medieval African kingdoms, royal women didn't just wear adornments. They wore biographies. Let's start with materials. You spot coral, real coral, carved into fat beads the size of marbles, strung so densely across a queen's chest it looks like a breastplate. These came from the Atlantic coast and were traded overland to the interior. That means those beads traveled further than most people ever did. By the time they reach her neck, they're more than decoration, they're proof of reach. Then there's ivory, worn in cuffs or carved into thin rings layered up the arm. Some are engraved with images, birds, snakes, suns. You ask what they mean. Someone shrugs, depends on the queen. That's code for, it's above your pay grade. You also spot cowrie shells, and you think, oh, cute accessory? Nope. Currency. Those little white shells were used as money in vast swaths of Africa. So when a queen walks past wearing a belt of them, she's not accessorizing, she's wearing the budget. Some queens preferred brass or bronze, metals believed to carry both spiritual and social weight. Polished to shine, these metals were often worked by elite smiths, people with titles, not just tools. Their designs weren't just pretty, they were coded. A knot pattern might symbolize unity. A swirl might ward off envy. That twisted torque around her neck? It might be a diplomatic gift from a neighboring kingdom. You learn that jewelry was often layered in stages. Heirlooms at the base, newer pieces on top. Necklaces weren't just stacked for sparkle, they told time. This one's from her mother, an attendant says, pointing to a flat pendant. This one's from her coronation. And then, there's the stuff woven into hair. Tiny golden beads tied into braids. Amber pinned near the scalp. Pieces so small, you'd miss them if you weren't paying attention. But together, they whisper something. Every inch of me speaks. Modern scholars still argue about the specifics. Were certain gemstones reserved only for royalty? Did a 5-strand bracelet mean senior queen versus junior consort? Was a nose ring a symbol of fertility or just a personal choice? The answers vary. Sources conflict. Oral traditions diverge. But one thing everyone agrees on? Jewelry wasn't optional. It was strategy. You remember hearing about Queen Amina of Zaza, famous warrior queen of the 16th century, whose rings were said to be forged from conquered city metal. Some say she wore gold on campaign. Others say she swapped it for iron. Either way, the message was clear. Power dresses itself. You glance again at the queen in front of you. Her anklets chime softly as she walks, every step echoing with centuries of meaning. She doesn't look weighed down. She looks anchored, wrapped in history, shining with intent. You stand there a little longer, just watching her pass. And for a brief second, you wonder what story your jewelry tells. You're in the market district now, not a commoner's market, but the royal one, tucked inside the palace walls, where even the stall umbrellas are made of embroidered silk and the air smells like cinnamon, papyrus, and sun-warmed fabric. You wander through bolts of fabric draped like waterfalls, each one more shimmering than the last. One glints silver. One shifts between green and gold depending on how the breeze hits. And then, you see it. Silk. Tonight, we're talking about the cloth that queens didn't just wear, they commanded. Because when we ask, what did medieval African queens really wear? The answer is often, whatever crossed the Sahara and cost more than a camel caravan. Let's talk trade. By the 13th and 14th centuries, African kingdoms like Mali, Kanem-Bornu, and Hausa city-states were deeply embedded in trans-Saharan trade routes. And one of the hottest commodities? Imported textiles. Silk from the Middle East. Damasks from Persia. Cotton from India. Even brocades from China, depending on the route. And queens. They had first pick. You're told of a queen in the Songhai Empire who received a shipment of patterned silk so rare, only 2 bolts existed, and she wore both at once during a lunar festival. The message was clear: wealth is what I wear casually. But imported fabric wasn't just for showing off. It was strategic. These garments often came as gifts from visiting diplomats, peace offerings, or part of marriage alliances. Sometimes they were tributes from vassal states. Meaning that cloak of embroidered red silk she's casually wearing while sipping millet beer? It might be the fabric version of a treaty. You run your fingers across a bolt of fabric, soft, smooth, and almost unnaturally light. The merchant says it's silk mixed with wild cotton, hand-woven by artisans near Lake Chad. And then he adds, the queen's version is heavier. She prefers hers weighted with bronze thread. You blink. Bronze thread? Yep. Some royal garments were reinforced with metallic fibers, either for durability, ceremony, or just to add a little blingy gravity. Not fun to sit in, but incredible for walking slowly and dramatically through a palace courtyard. Of course, queens didn't just import and wear this cloth, they commissioned it. Historical accounts tell us that royal women often had workshops attached to their compounds, staffed by weavers and dyers who took local patterns and mixed them with foreign materials. The result: hybrids. Robes with Persian floral motifs, bordered by West African knotwork. Tunics cut in Islamic styles but embroidered with regional fertility symbols. Was it fashion? Sure. Was it diplomacy in fiber form? Absolutely. And even now, scholars are still figuring out what all these hybrid styles meant. One textile fragment found near Gao had 4 distinct motifs, none local, all stitched in reverse direction. Debate still rages. Was it a mistake or a statement? You ask the merchant if queens ever recycled fabric. He scoffs. Not them. But their attendants wore the scraps. So technically, even royal leftovers carried status. You pause at a display of shawls, each labeled with names like Sun Snake and River Queen. You pick up one that's impossibly fine, woven so tightly it folds like paper. He whispers, that pattern was once only worn by priestesses. And just like that, you understand, the silk wasn't just fancy. It was coded. Imported cloth told people where you were connected, how powerful your alliances were, what your access looked like, Literally. If your robes glimmered with foreign thread, you weren't just a queen. You were a node in the network of kingdoms. So when you see her step into the hall wearing silk so luminous it reflects candlelight, that's not just luxury. That's strategy. And it flows behind her like a map only the wise can read. The air is sweet tonight, fragrant, earthy, and just a little smoky. Somewhere in the queen's compound, someone's grinding resin over a hot stone. You hear soft laughter, the splash of water, the rustle of fabric being folded. No crowns, no court today. Tonight, you're in the private quarters. And you're about to find out that even off-duty, a queen doesn't just lounge. She glows. Welcome to the world of henna, kohl, and sacred skin rituals, the royal beauty traditions of medieval African queens. Now, before you imagine anything out of a modern spa brochure, let's set the record straight. This wasn't Self-Care Sunday. This was intentional, ceremonial, status-loaded grooming, often with layers of spiritual and political meaning. Let's start with skin. Royal skin was serious business. Queens, and high-born women in general, used elaborate body oils, butters, and scrubs made from everything from shea and baobab to crushed flowers, herbs, and minerals. One mixture, made with ground camwood, gave skin a deep golden red tint and was believed to ward off bad energy. Another blend, used in the Sahel, mixed clay, turmeric, and fermented milk, doubling as both a beauty mask and an anti-sunburn shield. You peek into a basket and find a small gourd jar with carved patterns. Inside, a paste so fragrant it almost knocks you over. The attendant smiles and says, "This one is only for royal arms before moon ceremonies." You nod like you know what that means. You don't. But it smells divine. Then there's henna. In North and East Africa, especially in places like Nubia, Ethiopia, and along the Swahili coast, henna wasn't just for brides. It was for queens. Their hands, feet, and even scalps were sometimes decorated with intricate designs, floral, geometric, symbolic. One queen from Akuria, a medieval Nubian kingdom, was said to have her entire forearms patterned before coronation, symbolizing roots and rivers. Whether that's literal or poetic, we may never know. But we do know this: the dye was considered a blessing. Its color protected the body. Its process soothed the spirit. And the designs. Secret language. A looped spiral might represent fertility. A triangle pattern might signal strength. Some queens had personal motifs known only to their attendants. Then there's kohl. Think of it as ancient eyeliner, but with way more edge. Usually made from lead sulfide or ground charcoal, kohl was applied around the eyes not just to beautify, but to protect. Against glare, sand, and yes, evil spirits. In some areas, kohl was also considered a mark of wisdom. The darker the rim, the deeper the mind. You spot a carved ivory kohl stick beside a mirror polished from metal. No glass, no filters. Just the calm ritual of hands tracing along eyelids with absolute focus. And of course, scent. Oh, the scent. Frankincense from Somalia. Myrrh from Nubia. Cloves from Zanzibar. Queens didn't just smell good, they marked space with fragrance. Step into a room after she left, and you'd still know she'd been there. One traveler once wrote that a queen of Bornu was recognizable by her perfume before she even turned a corner. Another queen was rumored to store her garments in clay pots filled with dried herbs and orange peel, so that her cloak told a story before she ever spoke. Historians are still piecing together how these beauty traditions tied into politics and ritual. Did certain oils signify marital status? Did henna designs differ between kingdoms? Was scent used as soft diplomacy? There's no consensus, just clues. But here's what is clear: these weren't vanity routines. They were rituals of presence. They allowed the queen to show up fully, even before she said a word. So when she walks by you, barefoot, eyes rimmed in dark kohl, skin glowing like the gods rubbed cocoa butter on her personally, you don't think makeup. You think power, wrapped in scent, stamped in henna, and carved into memory. The sand kicks up as the wind shifts. The sky is low and gray. You're standing on a ridge overlooking the plains. No palace in sight, no ceremonial fans, no velvet cushions. Just dust, leather, and a line of figures on horseback moving like shadows across the horizon. And right in front of them, ***, riding tall, spear in hand, robes rippling behind her like a storm, ***, is the queen. Tonight, you're meeting the women who didn't just wear power. They charged into it. Welcome to the world of armored but beautiful, when African queens ruled kingdoms and battlefields, and dressed for both. Let's begin in the Sahel, where warrior queens were not a rarity, but a political category. Women like Queen Amina of Zaza, a 16th century legend, led cavalry into enemy cities, expanded territory, and, yes, wore armor. But not the clunky metal of medieval Europe. No. This was stitched leather, reinforced with iron scales, flexible enough to fight, and still stylish enough to identify her from half a mile away. Historical accounts describe her wearing red-dyed armor, symbolic of strength, aggression, and spiritual protection. Red wasn't just a mood. It was a spell, a message, a boundary line painted in fabric. But not every warrior queen dressed the same. Some preferred the wrapped robe method, layered tightly over the chest and arms with a belt that held throwing knives or daggers. Some robes were woven with metal threads, not just for flash, but for defense. It might not stop a spear, but it'd sure change your posture. And let's talk accessories. Because yes, these queens wore jewelry into battle. Sometimes as protection, blessed amulets on leather cords, bronze charms inscribed with prayers. Other times, as identifiers. A queen's anklet might chime so her enemies knew exactly who was coming. Psychological warfare? Yes, please. Then there's headgear. Some queens wore helmet-like turbans, wrapped high and tight, sometimes plated with brass. Others wore leather hoods, reinforced with fur lining and beadwork along the brow. In Benin, warrior queens were sometimes painted with chalk symbols, sun, snake, arrow, to signal divine alignment. And in Ethiopia, you'll find stories of empresses who rode out in layered cotton tunics covered by scale armor, with silk scarves tied around the waist not for flair, but to bind scrolls of holy scripture against their bodies. Cloth and creed. Armor and invocation. And here's where things really blur. Many queens didn't change outfits between court and campaign. They adapted them. A ceremonial sash became a warband. A cloak became a dust shield. A headdress was tightened to become a helmet. Their wardrobe didn't separate beauty and battle. It braided them together. Modern historians debate just how often these queens actually led troops directly. Some say the stories were symbolic. Others insist they were literal, especially in matrilineal societies where female rule was the norm, not the exception. There's even an academic feud over a 13th century engraving showing a queen from the Sahel on horseback with a sword. One side says it's propaganda. The other side says, so what? She still looked fabulous. And you know what? Both might be right. Because whether on the front lines or commanding from a ridge, the message was always the same. You can't separate the leader from the look. So when this queen gallops past you, braids flying, bronze studs flashing in her cloak, blade steady in one hand, you don't see a contradiction. You see someone who built her kingdom like she built her outfit. Layered, powerful, and ready for whatever comes. You're sweating now, not from fear or movement, but from the humid, glorious chaos of a tropical afternoon. You followed the queen inland, deep into the rainforests of the Congo Basin, where the trees are tall enough to make you whisper and the air feels like someone just wrung out the clouds and poured them on your shoulders. And yet, the queen looks radiant, unbothered, regal. Tonight, we're unraveling the secrets of climate couture, how medieval African queens dressed with intention and elegance, all while living in landscapes that demanded serious wardrobe strategy. Because look, ruling in the Sahel? Dry heat, blinding sun, dusty breezes. Ruling in the rainforest? Steam room, 24/7, with bugs. So what did queens wear when sweat threatened their majesty? Let's start with fabric choice. Heavy velvets and metal threaded robes? Cute for the desert courts, but here, the queen's favored lighter materials: hand-woven raffia cloth, bark fiber textiles, and finely spun cotton that let air move through every weave. Some of these fabrics were softened with oils or banana leaf juice, making them breathable and faintly shiny. You spot one such robe now, worn over a queen's shoulder, dyed with natural indigo and kohl nut, its hem fringed with tiny glass beads that tinkle every time she gestures. Yes, she makes beads sound expensive. And now, for structure. In swampy or hot regions like parts of present-day Angola, queens often wore wrappers, long, elegant cloths draped around the torso and hips, secured with jeweled pins or knotted at the shoulder. This left the arms free and allowed for maximum cooling without compromising presence. But don't get it twisted. This wasn't casual loungewear. These wraps were precision draped, sometimes layered with shell-decorated belts, embroidered bustbands, or elaborately folded sashes. One queen was said to own over 40 wraps, each dyed with a different mix of bark, leaves, clay, and ash, depending on the ceremony. Then comes accessorizing for the elements. Queens in equatorial climates often wore wide-brimmed woven crowns, part headpiece, part sun shield. Some were made with dyed grasses stiffened with tree resin. Others were decorated with parrot feathers, yes, parrots, meant to shimmer in the sun and scare off jealous spirits or nosy colonizers. One recorded ritual involved fanning the queen with palm fronds soaked in rosewater, then wrapping her in a misted shawl. Not for comfort, for effect. Her skin would glisten. Her robe would cling just enough. Her enemies would sweat. She wouldn't. Even footwear adapted. In desert regions, sandals dominated. But here, barefoot or soft leather slip-ons. Easier to move through muddy terrain. And more grounded, both spiritually and literally. You ask an attendant how the queen keeps cool in all this regalia. He chuckles. The queen doesn't sweat. The weather submits. Okay, sure. But even magic aside, there's real genius in the design. Modern researchers have pointed out how the layered fabrics actually create microclimates, tiny pockets of cooler air between the cloth and skin. The more breathable the weave, the better it worked. It's not unlike how desert peoples cover up completely for the same reason. But here, it's done with style. And as always, no detail was random. Even color shifted with climate. In hot, humid places, queens favored earth tones, greens, and deep browns, not to hide, but to connect with the land. Some patterns mimicked leaves. Others were circular, echoing the shapes of fruit, rivers, or moons. One queen's rain robe literally had a spiral of beads down the back, meant to represent water falling from the sky. And yes, it glittered when she danced. Historians still argue about how often queens modified their outfits based on weather, or if they had seasonal wardrobes. Some believe certain fabrics were only worn during the harmattan winds. Others think that every outfit had to be humidity-proof, or it wouldn't last a single festival. Either way, these queens weren't just dressing for the climate. They were controlling the climate around them. One fold, one bead of sweat, maybe, if the queen allows it. And somehow, even in 90% humidity, she still manages to look like the air waited for her to arrive. The sun is setting now, painting the palace walls in gold and shadows. You're seated on a cool stone bench, watching the queen prepare for the evening's ritual. Something ceremonial, something ancestral. You don't know all the details, but you can see one thing clearly. She's changed clothes. And not just outfit, color. Tonight, we're diving into the power of color, because for medieval African queens, color wasn't about mood. It was about meaning, presence, command. So let's talk pigments, symbols, and how one shade could shift an entire political room. Start with white. You'd think white means purity, and yes, it can. But in many African kingdoms, especially along the Niger River and into Yoruba territories, white was also the color of spirits, of rituals, of things not quite human. When a queen wore white, It often meant she was channeling something beyond herself, a goddess, an ancestor, a divine right. You're told that in the Oyo Empire, high queens wore flowing white wrappers and chalked their skin for oracle ceremonies. They were called living mirrors, reflecting messages from the divine. And if you saw her in white, you watched your mouth. Then there's red. Oh, red. This color meant fire, sometimes literally, as in battle. Other times, symbolically, bloodline, fertility, danger, command. In Benin, red was worn during funerals and warfare, signaling both mourning and readiness. Imagine a queen stepping out to bury a king wearing a red coral robe with matching beads down to her waist. She's grieving, but she's also saying, "This throne is still taken." Red also connected to certain deities, especially in matrilineal societies. A scarlet sash might invoke a river goddess. A crimson hem could signify a birth ritual. Some colors weren't worn every day. They were earned. Now let's meet blue and indigo, colors of depth, of secrets, of power that moves quietly. In Mali and Songhai courts, queens wore indigo robes layered with silver thread for nighttime ceremonies. The cloth was dyed so many times it shimmered black-blue, like a thunderstorm stitched into silk. Wearing blue wasn't just about prestige, it was about patience. Indigo took time, and queens had the resources to wait. Green, on the other hand, was associated with life, balance, diplomacy. You'd see it during peace negotiations or marriage rituals. Some Hausa queens were said to plant gardens of specific herbs around their quarters to draw down the green into their garments. Whether it worked, who's to say? But the symbolism was there. And then we get to gold. Not just the metal, the color. Gold dye, sometimes made from crushed ochre, other times painted over with metal dust, was rare, difficult to maintain, expensive to create. Which meant when a queen wore gold, she wasn't saying, "I'm wealthy." She was saying, "I am the wealth." You ask one of the palace artists how they chose which colors to use in royal robes. She laughs softly and says, "We don't choose. We ask the cloth." Which may sound poetic, but in a way, it's practical. Cloth was often dyed and stored for specific seasons, rituals, and moods. Some colors couldn't be worn during eclipses. Others were reserved for royal births. A deep wine red might mean the queen has made a decision. A sharp yellow? The queen is watching. And that brings us to forbidden colors. Yes, they existed. Some shades were reserved for one person only, the queen herself. If you were caught wearing that shade without permission, depending on the kingdom, the penalty ranged from a fine, to exile, to worse. One story tells of a merchant who wore a pale purple scarf that too closely resembled the queen's mourning color. The scarf was confiscated. The merchant was re-educated. He now sells shoes. Modern historians are still untangling the full meaning behind certain dyes and hues. Were some spiritual, seasonal, based on clan, or were they simply expressions of power that changed over time? The truth is likely a mix. But this much is clear. When a queen chose a color, she didn't just choose a look. She chose a message. So now, as the queen walks past you in flowing saffron robes, trimmed in black, dusted with ash-gray pearls, you don't ask why she chose that color. You ask, what is she about to do? And more importantly, who's about to find out? You're in the queen's inner courtyard now. It's quiet, but not empty. Around you, women are seated in low chairs or on woven mats, each one tending to something precise. Threading beads, weaving fiber, or carefully braiding hair. Not their own, mind you, each other's. And in the center, under a soft canopy of linen and shade, sits the queen. Not speaking, not ruling, just having her hair done. Tonight, we're climbing into the world of hair that holds history, because for many African queens, their hairstyles weren't just aesthetic choices. They were public declarations. Let's start with a fact. African hair is versatile, and African hairstyling? Even more so. Especially in royal settings, where queens were quite literally wearing their identity on their scalp. The queen in front of you today wears a style called something like ekari, a series of raised, fan-like braids that arch outward, balanced with a leather band wrapped around the crown of her head. The effect is geometric, elegant, and loud in the quietest way. You learn that in parts of medieval Nigeria, hairstyles could signify royal status, clan membership, even marital standing. And unlike a crown, you couldn't remove your hair. So it had to be right. A hairstyle wasn't just fashion. It was calendar plus language plus ID card braided together. Some queens had exclusive styles only they could wear. Think of it like royal crests, but in cornrows. Others commissioned hairstyle artists, specialists who created sculptural looks that mimicked birds, suns, or waves, each one tied to a myth or a personal achievement. And no, these weren't quick. Some could take up to 2 days to complete, especially if beads or cowries were involved. Imagine sitting for hours, neck tilted, while your attendants hum quietly and work their hands like magic wands. But here's the thing, these styles weren't only about what you saw. They were about what you knew. Hair was often tied to cosmology. In East African kingdoms, queens wore twisted plaits that mimicked river flows, a nod to the water spirits who protected fertility. In the Sahel, some queens shaved parts of their head in patterns representing moons, stars, or ancestral roads. And it wasn't all about hair on the head either. Some queens wore elaborate wigs, made from human hair, raffia, or even dyed goat hair. These were shaped, perfumed, and stored with care, like you might protect a piece of ceremonial armor. There's one story from the Swahili coast about a queen whose wig was so large, it required its own seat during dinner. Another had hers blessed by a priest before she wore it into court, where it was said to grant her uninterrupted speech. Historians love to debate what exactly these hairstyles meant. Some argue they were merely decorative. Others say they were literally codified, like visual poems. One carving from the kingdom of Ife shows a queen with 12 vertical braids, each tipped with a bead, spaced evenly like clock points. Was it a ritual calendar? A representation of seasons? A tribute to the 12 mothers of the land? No one knows for sure. But when you see the queen turn her head and her braids glint in the light just so, you feel like you're reading something, even if you don't know the language. That's what hair did. It told history without sound. And just like the fabrics, the jewelry, the crowns, it had rules. Some styles couldn't be worn during mourning. Others were reserved for coronations. A few were considered so sacred, they had to be taken down in silence. You glance back at the queen now. Her hair is nearly done. Her head has become a kind of living crown, braided with such precision it almost looks carved. She lifts her chin slightly, and the entire courtyard shifts. People sit up. Someone stops weaving. Because her hair has finished speaking. You're near the royal path now, the kind that only a queen walks on. It's not marked by signs or banners, but by silence. The kind of hush that happens when everyone knows something important is about to appear. And then you hear it. Not trumpets, not drums, but the soft jingle of beads, the creak of finely worked leather, the unmistakable rhythm of someone approaching with a purpose. You lower your gaze and notice something unexpected. Her feet. Tonight, we're talking about royal footwear and barefoot power moves, because sometimes what a queen wears on her feet is as powerful as what she wears off them. Let's start with the obvious. Not every queen wore shoes. Not because she couldn't afford them, please, but because sometimes bare feet meant more. In many medieval African cultures, particularly across the Sahel and Central Africa, going barefoot was ritual, not random. A queen might walk barefoot into a sacred grove, onto royal soil, or across ancestral stone, not out of modesty, but as a sign of direct connection to the earth. You ask someone why the queen doesn't wear sandals. They answer softly, because the ground needs to know her. Yeah, let that one settle. Now, when she did wear something, it wasn't what you're thinking. Forget stiff European shoes or high-heeled drama. These were crafted slippers, beaded sandals, or soft leather soles sewn to fit the exact curve of her foot. In some kingdoms, like those along the Swahili coast, footwear was custom-made from dyed cowhide, with silver studs and embroidered designs visible only from above. Because the point wasn't for you to see them. The point was for her to feel them. Queens of the Mali Empire were said to wear gold-threaded foot wraps that tied around the ankle in a spiral. These weren't for walking far, they were for ceremony. When she crossed the courtyard in those wraps, people didn't clap. They bowed. Because gold on the feet. That's not an accessory. That's a statement. Other accounts describe royal footwear as having protective properties. Some were rubbed with blessed oils, others sewn with small charms or inscribed leather patches containing verses, prayers, or ancestral names. A pair of sandals could carry more security than a palace guard. One traveler in the 14th century described a queen in present-day Ghana wearing sandals, beaded like a mosaic, with iron beads around the edge so she made music with every step. Another account from Bornu describes a queen who wore glass beads around her toes, not for function, but so they'd catch the moonlight during night rituals. And here's a twist you weren't expecting. Some queens wore mismatched footwear, intentionally. You heard that right. One sandal beaded in red, the other in white. One foot bare, one foot covered. Symbolic of balance, duality, choice. People would whisper about it for weeks. You ask an elder if that's just myth. She replies, no myth. That queen didn't walk. She performed movement. Of course, even the act of removing footwear had meaning. Taking off your shoes before entering a sacred space is still practiced today in many African traditions, but for a queen, it was also a gesture of power. It said, I don't need barriers between me and what I command. Some coronation rituals required the queen to step barefoot onto sacred ground, to accept the weight of leadership without insulation. Others had her walk across ritual sand or woven mats, textures chosen specifically to awaken her senses and bind her to the land. Modern scholars still debate the purpose of certain sandal designs found in archaeological digs. Were they purely decorative, functional, symbolic? The answers often blur together. Because in this world, fashion wasn't divided from function. It was function with flair. So now, as the queen steps past you, barefoot on stone, a chain of silver beads around her ankle, toes painted in crushed indigo dye, you don't stare in surprise. You bow. Because she doesn't walk like she needs shoes. She walks like the ground already belongs to her. The drums are distant now, barely audible behind the thick palace walls. Candles flicker in quiet corners. The queen sits in a carved wooden chair, surrounded by shadows, voices low and serious. This isn't a festival. It's not a coronation. It's not even a negotiation. This is a war council. And the queen? She's dressed for it. Tonight, we're looking at the difference between ceremonial clothing and war room wear, because African queens didn't just have a public image. They had a wardrobe strategy. Let's start with the ceremonial side. During coronations, weddings, and state rituals, queens were wrapped in the visual equivalent of fireworks. We're talking layered silk robes, wide sashes of embroidered velvet, cloaks covered in brass discs, coral bead belts, and head wraps stacked high enough to cast shade. These outfits weren't just for beauty. They were coded messages. Gold. I am wealth. White. I speak for the ancestors. Red. I have blood rights and no fear. And the volume. Oh, these outfits swished. They were made to echo through palace halls, so everyone knew exactly where the queen was, even if they didn't dare look directly at her. But when it came to governing behind closed doors, things changed. The outfit got quieter, but not less powerful. In war councils, dispute resolutions, or secret religious ceremonies, the queen might trade all that sparkle for structure. She'd wear stripped-down garments, not plain, but precise. A tightly wrapped wrapper in deep indigo. A long-sleeved cotton robe embroidered only at the cuffs. A sash tied lower on the hips, signaling this wasn't about spectacle, it was about strategy. You hear that in some regions, the queen's robe for council had no pattern at all. A deliberate contrast to the symbolism-packed garments worn in public. Her message? I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to decide your future. Some accounts describe queens donning dark, non-reflective fabrics during full moon ceremonies, especially those related to justice or ancestral consultation. One queen was known to wear a robe dyed with charcoal and indigo, covered in a single braided cord that wrapped once around her waist and then fell to the floor. No one dared ask what it meant. And sometimes, the clothing was camouflaged by ritual. A queen preparing for battle strategy might wear a men's robe during the meeting, not because she was rejecting femininity, but because she was stepping into a different role. The same woman who wore gold-threaded sandals at a wedding might walk into a planning chamber in tough leather slippers and a short tunic tied at the shoulders. You ask an elder if queens ever wore armor inside. She replies, only when they already knew the decision. Oof. Now, flip it back. If you saw a queen wearing her ceremonial clothes in a governing room, that was a sign. It meant she was performing judgment publicly, even if no crowd was watching. It meant she was invoking power visually, not just politically. And if you saw her wear war robes into a festival, someone was probably about to be removed. Every garment choice mattered. The neckline, the number of folds, whether the sash sat above or below the waist, whether her anklet was visible or hidden. Historians still debate the meanings of certain changes in fabric and cut. Was a shorter tunic symbolic of mobility or just practical? Was an all-black robe a sign of mourning or metaphysical invocation? The queens, of course, didn't leave us a dress code. Because the point wasn't to explain. The point was to signal. So now, as you watch her rise from the council seat, robe dark, hair wrapped tightly, arms bare except for two thin copper bands, you understand. She's not dressed to be admired. She's dressed to be obeyed. It's midday now, and the courtyard is buzzing, not loudly, but with that quiet energy of people preparing for something big. Servants adjust canopies. Attendants sweep fine sand into intricate patterns on the palace floor. Musicians tune their instruments with barely audible plucks. But something's missing. The queen. Or more accurately, you can't see her. Tonight, we're exploring a subtler part of royal fashion. What commoners saw and didn't. Because in many African courts, queens didn't just show up and dazzle. They also controlled visibility, layering their presence with fabric, space, and tradition in ways that made them almost mythical. Let's start with distance. In large kingdoms like Mali or Bornu, the queen's physical proximity was heavily controlled. A commoner might hear her voice before ever seeing her face. She might appear behind a veil, a screen, or layers of attendants, creating an intentional blur between the royal and the reachable. Her clothing, part of the illusion. You hear about queens who wore multiple head coverings, each one more detailed than the last. The outer layer, a plain wrap. The second, embroidered with protective symbols. The final one, only glimpsed during blessings or declarations, was beaded, shaped, and possibly blessed by a priestess. You ask a local storyteller what the people thought the queen looked like under all those layers. He smiles. Depends who you ask. That's the point. In some palaces, the queen walked with a sunshade or fan bearer, not because of heat, but because you weren't supposed to see her too clearly. Her garments were layered to move like water, to distract your eyes with movement, shine, and sound. A glimpse of her ankle might be more powerful than a full speech. And then there were veils. Some queens wore netted face veils woven from fine thread or even strands of hair. Others used veils embedded with cowrie shells or beads, clinking softly as they walked, like a privacy curtain with a soundtrack. These veils weren't worn all the time. But when they appeared, it meant the queen was present, but not available. Historians describe one Nubian queen who was only seen unveiled during eclipse rituals. When the sun disappeared, so did the veil. Her face and the sky were never visible at the same time. Iconic. In Swahili city-states, queens often appeared on balconies rather than walking through crowds. Their robes would hang over the edge, silk and gold dancing in the sea breeze, while they spoke from above, their faces shadowed by carved lattice. It created a kind of fashion mystique. You never saw the whole outfit, just the movement of the robe, just a hand adjusting a bracelet, just a voice behind beaded cloth. And yes, this extended to ritual seating. Sometimes the queen would be seated behind a translucent curtain, or even in a small structure within the room. Her words were delivered aloud, but her clothing was seen only in partial glimpses. Her robe's sleeve edge might become famous. Her shoe pattern could be whispered about for weeks. Still, not all queens stayed hidden. Some used contrast visibility, appearing in full regalia only when it mattered. Imagine the crowd goes silent. The drums pause. And then from behind a curtain, the queen steps forward in full sunlight, her robe glittering like water, her veil pulled aside just enough to catch your eyes and hold them. One scholar calls this power by presence. Another calls it visual hierarchy. But to the people, it was simply a moment you'd tell your grandchildren about. You ask again, why all the concealment? A court attendant answers, because to lead, she doesn't need to be seen all the time. She needs to be remembered. And that's what the layers are for. Not to hide the queen, but to make the glimpses last longer. The palace walls feel different tonight. Quieter, heavier. You're in the embroidery room, yes, it's a thing, and it smells like thread, beeswax, and stories too old for books. The room isn't flashy. No gold, no glitter. Just rows of cloth, some stretched on wooden frames, others folded neatly, each one dense with color, texture, and code. Because tonight, we're reading the robes. Welcome to the world of embroidered messages, where every stitch might carry a proverb, a warning, or a piece of personal history you'd miss if you didn't look close. Let's start with the obvious. Queens didn't wear plain clothes unless plain was part of the plan. More often, they wore fabrics so loaded with symbolism that every fold whispered something. You lean over one robe laid flat on the table. It looks simple at first, deep blue cotton with red trim, until you notice a tiny embroidered bird near the hem. Parrot, you think. But then you notice another, and another, and suddenly you realize they're all facing the same direction. You ask the embroiderer what it means. She smiles. She's telling someone to leave. Ah, now you're listening. In West African courts, embroidery was a literal language, used to record lineage, beliefs, alliances, and threats, all stitched into silk and cotton. Some designs were full patterns, spirals for continuity, zigzags for protection, interlocked lines for community. Others were pictorial, eyes for vigilance, snakes for cunning, keys for access or control. And these weren't random. There were rules. Only certain families had the right to wear specific motifs. Some queens could commission unique patterns, once stitched, never copied. Wearing someone else's emblem? Social suicide. Possibly actual exile. You're told of a robe worn by a 15th century queen of the Hausa kingdom. From a distance, it looked like geometric shapes. But up close, each one was a stylized drum, a reference to a proverb about leadership. Even the wind listens to rhythm. You can't prove it was a warning. But her rivals sure didn't challenge her again. Some embroidery told love stories, too. One queen stitched a band of overlapping crescent moons around the sleeve of her festival robe. According to oral tradition, it referenced her late husband's favorite riddle: what rises before it's ready and disappears before it's gone? The moon. Also, love. Oof. There were also hidden messages. Literally, inside linings, beneath collars, on the underside of hems. For the queen to feel, not show. One robe found in a palace archive had a band of thread under the armhole, embroidered with a phrase that loosely translated to, "Don't let your silence betray you." A reminder? A prayer? A prophecy? We'll never know. And modern historians, oh, they're still arguing. Were certain symbols universal? Or did every palace have its own thread code? Was a spiral always spiritual? Or just a pretty filler? Some say the designs were secretive on purpose, meant to be recognized only by those with the right eyes. You sit with that idea for a moment. Because maybe that's what power really is. Not everyone understanding you, just the right people understanding enough. You glance at another robe. It's cream with black embroidery, a line of teeth. Or is it mountains? Or shields? The room attendant shakes her head. That one, she says. Even I don't know what it means. But the queen wears it when she doesn't want to be interrupted. Noted. And suddenly, you realize, a queen didn't always have to speak. Didn't always have to declare. Didn't always need a crown. Sometimes, she just wore a sentence. And let the stitching do the rest. The courtyard is lively again, but not in the usual ceremonial way. There's a caravan rolling in, its camels clopping steadily, led by merchants with sun-darkened faces and clothes caked in sand. They speak in Arabic, Berber, Portuguese, and a handful of languages you don't even recognize. But what they carry, that you understand immediately. Textiles, jewelry, tools, dyes, fabrics with names longer than your patience. And right there at the top of the palace steps, watching the procession with the calm of someone who already knows what she's going to accept or reject, stands the queen. Because tonight, we're diving into imported influence versus local legacy, and how African queens knew exactly how to balance outside beauty with internal brilliance. You see, medieval African kingdoms weren't cut off from the world. Far from it. Through trans-Saharan trade, Indian Ocean commerce, and even overland routes to Europe and Asia, queens had access to the global runway, long before there was a runway. From Persian silks to Chinese brocade, from Indian cottons to Portuguese lace, foreign traders brought their finest goods. But here's what sets African queens apart. They didn't just wear imports. They wove them into their own narrative. You glance at the queen's current outfit, an outer robe of indigo-dyed cotton, definitely local, but hemmed with imported silk ribbon embroidered in Farsi. It's not a costume, it's collaboration. She's not copying another culture. She's curating it. Some records speak of Swahili queens who wore Chinese silk pants under their ceremonial wraps, paired with coral bead corsets from Mozambique, and crowned with turbans styled in Persian fashion. The result. Not eclectic, iconic. You're told of a queen from Kilwa who commissioned a robe stitched entirely from fragments of imported cloth, each square representing a different trade partner. Was it patchwork diplomacy? Probably. Was it incredibly cool? Definitely. But local styles didn't disappear. They held their ground, and often outshone foreign luxury. Many queens insisted on having indigenous weavers replicate imported patterns using local materials. The result. Looks that nodded to international aesthetics while staying rooted in homegrown craftsmanship. One queen from the Kingdom of Congo famously refused to wear a fully imported gown sent by a Portuguese diplomat. Instead, she had it deconstructed, rewoven with raffia fiber, and restyled into a wrap that matched her royal colors. She then sent a note that said, roughly translated, "Your cloth is good. My hands are better." You ask a palace scribe how queens decided what foreign trends to adopt. He grins. If it speaks the queen's story, it stays. If not, it's sold back to the traders. Fashion as filter. Love it. Of course, some adoptions sparked debate. Did Egyptian patterns influence Nubian robes, or was it the other way around? Did Indian block prints actually become part of West African dye techniques, or were they simply admired and moved on? Historians still squabble. But one thing's clear, African queens weren't passive recipients. They weren't dazzled by whatever came off the camel. They were editors. They took what worked, what fit, what aligned with their cultural codes, and they left the rest. It's like if a designer label showed up in your DMs and instead of drooling, you just casually replied, "Thanks, I'll use the sleeves." You glance again at the queen, who now holds a bolt of fabric up to the light. It shimmers faintly, imported no doubt, but you already know what'll happen. She'll mix it with her family's pattern. Add cowrie buttons. Stitch a proverb inside the hem. And by the time it touches her shoulders, it'll be hers. You're standing in a palace storeroom, but don't picture dusty shelves and forgotten crates. This place is glowing. Literally. Bolts of fabric stacked like treasure, metal chests filled with folded robes, and the soft sound of fabric being counted by hand. And then, a whisper floats past you. This robe was once used to pay a soldier. Wait, what? Tonight, we're unraveling a detail many forget. Some royal clothing wasn't just worn. It was spent. Welcome to the fascinating world where cloth was currency, and queens didn't just wear their power, they budgeted it. Let's break it down. In many medieval African kingdoms, cloth wasn't just luxury. It was liquid wealth. Before coin economies became widespread, kingdoms like Mali, Kanem-Bornu, and Oyo used fine textiles as a trusted form of payment for soldiers, officials, and yes, even rival rulers. And who controlled the really valuable cloth? The queen. She had her own storerooms, her own weavers, her own textile taxes. Some queens were known to gift bolts of fabric in place of gold, because fine, dyed, hand-embroidered cloth, especially with indigo or imported silk thread, was just as precious and sometimes harder to fake. You spot one cloth now, thick, dark blue, with geometric stitching near the edge. It looks like formal wear. Turns out, it was part of a peace treaty. Queens often used robes as diplomacy, not just as outfits, but as currency instruments. A robe woven for 3 months could be given to secure loyalty from a governor. A wrap trimmed with coral beads might be part of a bride price. A cloak passed down from mother to daughter might pay the tribute tax of a vassal village. You learn that in the kingdom of Dahomey, special textile tokens called cloth parcels were used in royal negotiations, bundles of dyed and folded cloth that carried messages. Their size, color, and presentation style communicated everything from praise to warning. And yes, this practice extended into military economics. A queen preparing for war might distribute fabric to her captains, both to fund their campaigns and to mark their rank. The brighter the cloth, the closer to the throne. A general might wear a cloak given by the queen into battle, knowing it was both a symbol and a stipend. Even punishments involved cloth. A noble who fell out of favor might have their royal garments reclaimed, not just to strip them of honor, but to cut them off economically. In a society where fine cloth equaled credibility, losing your robe could mean losing your voice. And let's not forget gifting as control. A queen might gift fabric to a merchant, but only after they swore loyalty. Or she might send robes to a neighboring ruler, choosing colors that subtly referenced old debts or new alliances. You ask a clerk whether every cloth had a story. He nods. Some are just beautiful. Most are receipts. And historians, they're still catching up. Textiles don't last like stone or metal. Many of these robes are remembered only through oral history. The blue with 5 stripes, the mourning wrap from the last queen, the wedding sash that paid for a new granary. So when you look at a queen's wardrobe now, you can't just ask, what did she wear? You have to ask, who got paid? Because some outfits were never worn at all. They sat folded in boxes, waiting for the right moment, to buy loyalty, secure peace, or seal a marriage. Cloth as contract. Dress as diplomacy. Robes as real estate. And just when you think it couldn't get cooler, you hear this. There was once a queen in Hausaland who paid her entire guard in cloth dyed with her personal symbol. So every warrior was literally wrapped in her name. It's early morning now. The mist hasn't lifted yet, and everything feels quieter, like the palace itself is stretching. In one corner of the queen's compound, there's a burst of giggles, the unmistakable sound of small feet on polished floors, and the high-pitched clinking of beads. You turn the corner and see them, royal children, and leading them with the seriousness of a pint-sized general is a girl, maybe 8, maybe 10, her hair braided high, her tunic just a bit too ornate to be casual. She's wearing a mini crown. Tonight, we step into a rarely seen corner of royal life. What did young princesses wear? Because queens didn't just appear one day. They were raised and dressed for the role long before they wore the full regalia. Let's start with the crown. You notice it's not made of gold. This one is woven leather, dyed deep red, with a row of tiny brass beads along the edge. Decorative, sure, but also symbolic. In many kingdoms, young royal girls wore scaled-down versions of the queen's headgear, not as costumes, but as training crowns. Each piece they wore taught them something. A beaded anklet might symbolize connection to the ancestors. A sash tied a certain way could mean, this child is heir to the market lands, or this daughter will oversee rituals. Every garment, a hint, a lesson, a promise. You hear about a tradition from the Kingdom of Sign in present-day Senegal, where princesses wore ankle bells during specific seasons, not for decoration, but so everyone always knew where they were. The queen said, a royal child must be heard before she is missed. Chills. Their robes, not miniature versions of adult ones. More like introductory editions, hand-woven cotton, dyed in safe but noble colors. Cream, soft blue, deep green. No gold yet, but maybe a strip of copper thread here, or a single coral bead sewn into the neckline. You ask why not gold? A tutor answers, because she hasn't made decisions big enough to carry it yet. Fair. In some traditions, girls began their textile education early, not just wearing robes, but helping choose fabrics, fold wraps, or embroider tiny charms into their own sleeves. One princess was known to stitch the same sun symbol onto every tunic she wore until she was crowned. People started calling her Little Daylight. She grew up to become queen, kept the nickname, and the sun pattern. It became royal standard. You also hear about rite of passage garments. When a princess reached a certain age, often around first menstruation, she'd receive her first official robe from the queen, usually during a private ceremony, attended only by women of the royal household. The robe itself wasn't flashy, but its lining, covered in hand-stitched blessings from aunties, priestesses, and political mentors. And that mini crown? It might only be worn once a year, during a festival when royal children were formally presented to the court. The crown says, this one is being shaped. This one watches everything. Some princesses grew up into full power. Others became religious leaders, trade envoys, or political advisors. Their early garments stayed with them, not just in memory, but sometimes quite literally. One queen was buried in a sash she first wore at age 5. You look again at the girl in front of you. She's directing 2 boys on how to carry baskets of flowers to the main hall. Her voice is steady. Her expression, already regal. And her tunic? Just stiff enough in the shoulders to suggest authority, but short enough to run in. Historians don't often focus on royal children. There's less documentation, fewer artifacts, and lots of myth. But if you listen closely to the oral stories, there's a common thread. Power was cultivated early, not forced, not rushed, but worn like sunlight, bit by bit, robe by robe, until one day, a child becomes a storm. And the crown fits just right. The moon is high now, casting silvery light across the empty palace walkways. Most of the court is asleep, or pretending to be, but not you. You're following a shadow. Soft footsteps, a whisper of fabric, a rustle behind a column. Then silence. And then, from around a corner, a queen appears. But this time, she's not wearing silk. No gold, no coral, no ceremonial guards or velvet fans. She's in plain cloth, head uncovered, anklets removed. And just like that, we enter one of the most curious, whispered about chapters of royal fashion. When the queen dressed like someone else. Tonight, you're walking in the quiet footsteps of queens disguised as commoners. Now don't get too excited. We're not talking about some Disney-level street disguise with apples and a secret identity. This wasn't about escape. It was about control, strategy, listening, testing. In many African courts, especially those with bustling markets or complex palace hierarchies, queens were known to occasionally move incognito, wrapped in everyday cloth, face unpainted, jewelry tucked away. Sometimes with a trusted aide, sometimes alone. Why? Because no report beats what you hear with your own ears. One oral tradition from the Ashanti Kingdom tells of a queen who walked through the night market in a plain wrapper and headscarf, asking vendors what they really thought of the palace's new trade tax. The vendor didn't know who she was. She got the truth. The next day, the policy changed. Another tale from the Kanem-Bornu Empire speaks of a queen who visited shrines disguised as a pilgrim, to hear what the diviners were saying about her reign. It wasn't flattery, apparently, but it was useful. And here's what makes it even more powerful. These queens didn't just wear peasant clothing. They inhabited it. They walked like laborers, sat like weavers, blended into the rhythm of their people. Not to mock it, but to understand it, to reconnect. It took confidence to do this, and skill. The wrong step, the wrong wrap of fabric, the wrong silence. A trained eye could spot a royal in rags from a mile away. But the successful ones, they were masters of code switching in cotton. Some even wore dual-layer robes, simple outerwear that concealed finer fabric beneath. If discovered, they could simply unwrap and instantly shift back into queen mode. Think of it as the medieval version of reveal fashion, but strategic. Of course, there were risks. A few historical records mention queens being recognized and quickly surrounded, forced to end the experiment early. One story even tells of a queen who was scolded by an old woman in the street for walking too slowly. Rather than reveal herself, the queen apologized and moved aside. Later, that woman was given a new roof and 5 goats. You smile at that. Because here's the thing, humility wasn't weakness. Disguise didn't mean shame. It meant the queen trusted her own sense of self so deeply, she didn't need the robe to feel royal. She was the robe. Modern historians debate whether these stories are literal or allegorical, examples of royal closeness to the people or symbolic tales passed down to reinforce moral leadership. But the clothing, that was real. Simple dyed wraps, undyed tunics, faded sashes, no patterns, no titles, no crown. And yet, you still feel it. As the queen passes you now, wrapped in quiet, walking barefoot along the stone corridor, there's a kind of gravity to her steps. She disappears into a side passage. No one bows. No one speaks. But you know. You saw it. Power, when it's real, doesn't always need to shine. Sometimes, it walks softly in the dark. The sun is just beginning to rise, painting long shadows across the outer walls of the palace. You're seated on a carved stone step, warm cloth draped over your shoulders, eyes fixed on the slowly brightening horizon. You're not alone. The queen stands nearby. But she's not dressed like a ruler this morning, not in the way you've come to expect. No crown, no sashes, just a woven cotton wrapper, soft with wear, and a simple beaded anklet tapping against the stone. And yet, this might be the most powerful she's looked all week. Because today, she's not dressing for herself. She's dressing the kingdom. Tonight, well, this morning, we close our journey with one final, far-reaching ripple of royal fashion. When the queen dressed the people. Because the influence of medieval African queens didn't stop at palace walls. Their choices, every robe, wrap, braid, and bead, filtered down, spread outward, and shaped how everyone else dressed, celebrated, mourned, and walked through the world. Let's start in the marketplace. If a queen wore a robe with a new sash style, you could be sure that within weeks, local tailors would be stitching versions of it into their next offerings. Not exact copies, those would have been forbidden, but interpretations. A different trim. A more accessible fabric. A neighborhood version of the queen's silhouette. And yes, the queens knew this. Some even strategically debuted looks in public, knowing they'd be replicated. One story tells of a queen in the Yoruba courts who wore a wrap dyed in marigold and black, colors typically not paired. The people whispered, then imitated. Soon, that color scheme became the uniform of new brides. You ask a palace seamstress if the queen minds people copying her style. She smiles and says, she doesn't copy. She sets the rhythm. Like a drumbeat, steady, consistent, felt across the kingdom. And beyond fashion, the queen's choices shaped ritual clothing too. What she wore during ceremonies influenced how priestesses dressed. Her mourning cloth patterns became the colors of grief for generations. If she introduced a new type of cloth during a festival, people might assume it was blessed, and use that style for future rites. Even color language flowed outward. If the queen chose to wear pale green during a time of political uncertainty, commoners might begin to associate that color with quiet resilience. Years later, that same green might show up in baby blessings, funerals, or peace negotiations. One anthropologist once said, "A queen's robe is a cultural seed. Once she wears it, it grows everywhere." And the seeds planted by these queens grew into entire ecosystems of dress, expression, and meaning. Their stylistic decisions echoed not just into court life, but into how tailors cut cloth, how dancers tied wraps, how mothers dressed their daughters for rites of passage. Sometimes, a single cuff or sleeve style could become a generational marker. This was the Queen Adane fold, someone might say. This pattern bloomed after Queen Ramata's first drought ceremony. And even now, long after those queens are gone, some patterns remain. Hidden in wedding dresses, braided into festival hair, passed down like lullabies stitched in cotton. You watch as the queen in front of you bends slightly, picks up a small piece of folded cloth from a servant's hands. It's plain, just cotton. But she turns it in her fingers like it's the most important thing she's worn all week. She drapes it over one shoulder, lets it hang gently. And somehow, just like that, a new chapter begins. Not because she said anything, but because she wore it. The palace is asleep again. The fires are dim, the courtyard is still, and the echoes of footsteps are long gone. But you're still here, wrapped in the soft memory of fabric, in the shimmer of coral beads and the hush of embroidered messages. You've walked through golden courts, dusted your feet on ritual paths, and stood close enough to feel the breath behind a veil. And now, it's time to let it go. Let the robes fall into memory. Let the crowns dissolve into mist. Let the stories fold themselves gently, like cloth placed back into a cedar-lined chest. Because you've seen something rare tonight. Not just what medieval African queens wore, but how they wove themselves into time, into fabric, into the very shape of their kingdoms. So now, breathe. A little slower, a little deeper. You're not in the palace anymore. But maybe, just maybe, you're carrying a thread of it with you. Let it wrap around you like soft cotton. Let it whisper like beads on a sash. Let it remind you that beauty can be power, and silence can speak volumes. You've walked with queens tonight. And now, it's time to rest like one.